Ever worried that someday you might just up and disappear? There's nothing quite like a Sunday afternoon picnic in the park. The fresh air, the lazy hours sprawled out across a blanket, sharing company, food, drinks, and the beauty of the outdoors. The young man and his girlfriend spent their afternoon doing just that, enjoying a bit of slow living on a Sunday. Now, the sunset has streaked the sky with red and orange, and the air is beginning to cool to a less pleasant chill. It's time to pack up the remnants of the picnic and head on home. He carries the blanket, and she carries the basket, each of them keeping one hand free so they can still hold hands. They begin the walk back to the young man's apartment through the steadily emptying park. It's a familiar walk, one they've taken every Sunday for the past year that they've been together, and they take it at the same slow, easy pace as the picnic. There's no rush. Not today. That's what Monday mornings are for. Right now, there's just the sunset, the park, and her hand in his. The young man catches a glimpse of a squirrel burying a nut in the dirt under a nearby tree. He goes to squeeze his girlfriend's hand to point out the adorable sight, but she pulls her hand out of his. She's changed course, walking toward a pair of benches, transfixed on something there. She asks in a strangely panicked voice whether he saw it. Strange, he can't spot anything out of the ordinary. The girlfriend insists, with unnerving intensity, that she saw some kind of strange light for a split second. Something that was gone as soon as it appeared, but left an indelible impression. The young man laughs uneasily. Something's wrong. Can't quite explain what it is. The hairs on the back of his neck are standing up. He tries to change the subject back to the squirrel. He turns to point out the squirrel again, but she remains fixated on whatever she can see that he can't. He can feel a knot forming in his stomach, a sense of dread, as his body screams at him to get out of there as fast as he can. He tries to soothe his overactive nervous system, to remind himself that there's no danger here. But just before he turns back to his girlfriend to suggest they hurry home, he hears a soft thud as something lands in the grass. He turns to see the picnic basket lying on the ground, dropped there all of a sudden. His girlfriend is nowhere to be found. He calls out to her, but there's no answer. It's as if she vanished into thin air. Terrified, the young man combs the park for any trace of her, but aside from the picnic basket, there's nothing. He calls the police and files a missing persons report, but there's little they can do. There are no signs of any foul play, no reason to believe anything has happened to her. She was simply there one moment and gone the next. The young man doesn't sleep a wink that night. He calls out of work the next day, determined to continue his search. If the police can't help him, he'll just have to get to the bottom of things on his own. He calls his girlfriend's parents, but they haven't heard from her since Saturday. Her friends haven't seen her or received so much as a text. She didn't go into work either. Desperate for answers, he returns to the park, pacing back and forth in the spot where she vanished by the benches. As he does, he hears a sudden sound that makes his heart leap into his throat. Her voice, just a whisper, as if her lips are mere inches from his ear. She calls his name. She asks him what happened. He doesn't know what to say. He whirls around, searching for her face, but she isn't there. Is it just his imagination? His grief causing him to hallucinate the voice he wants to hear the most? There it is again, her whispering to him, telling him that she loves him, that she misses him, that she can't feel her body anymore. The young man's knees buckle, and he collapses onto the grass, weeping. It's as if she's right there, but just out of reach. He can hear her, but he can't see her, can't touch her. He asks her what on earth happened. I don't know. I don't know where I am. I don't know what I am. I don't. Her voice grows weaker, fading to static. She's fading away, and he can't do anything to hold on to her. His eyes settle on the tree where he saw the squirrel the day before. The bark swirls in a pattern that, when he stares at it too long and lets his eyes unfocus, looks almost like her face. He reaches out, brushing his fingers against the bark. It isn't her. Of course it isn't her. He doesn't hear the voice again. Maybe it was never really there at all. But he can't shake the feeling that she's still there, somehow, somewhere, like she's just out of sight, on some other plane of existence he can't see. Sitting there, in the grass where she disappeared, he can feel her so clearly in his mind. He has a sudden, vivid memory of their first date. She spilled her coffee all over him, and they had to go back to her place so she could lend him a clean pair of pants. She was terrified he would be angry, but they laughed about it for the rest of the day instead. He can smell that coffee, feel that laughter bubbling in his throat. It's more vivid than a simple memory. It's her, somehow. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spots something strange. A fluorescent, glowing light, radiating blue and yellow, twisting and turning in his peripheral vision. He turns toward it and climbs to his feet. He reaches out toward the shape, unable to stop himself, and then he's gone. The police would never discover what happened to the couple. How could they? They were victims of a force that the authorities could never hope to understand. This young man and his girlfriend encountered an anomaly known as SCP-7783. SCP-7783 is a semi-corporeal ontokinetic tetrahedral construct. Try to say that 5 times fast. The physicality of the anomaly is of dubious and spurious nature. As a facet of its containment, the anomaly is semantoconceptually bound to the statement contained within Unit 7783 of Site 196. SCP-7783 cannot always be perceived, and its perceptibility varies depending on the nature of the person attempting to perceive it. When effectively perceived, the anomaly emits a fluorescent glow on the blue-yellow gradient and maintains a fixed position in space no matter what kinetic force is used against it. SCP-7783 is extremely difficult to physically interact with, and can only be done using a complex series of actions known as semantoconceptual interactivity. This is also the method through which SCP-7783 was contained. There are unfortunate consequences to effectively interacting with SCP-7783 on a physical level. Doing so causes abstraction, biological, conceptual, and ontokinetic in affected subjects. This tends to result in said subject transforming into an intangible conceptual sapience. I'll elaborate a bit more on that side effect in a moment. Individuals subject to the influence of SCP-7783 who are affiliated with the Foundation are referred to as Personnel-Associated Sapient Concepts, or PASCs. These sapient concepts still retain their higher cognitive functions, though they lack the biological functions associated with their original physical human forms. They are still capable of interacting with reality via cognitive subversive impression, or the limited and brief interference in the psychological and neurological activity of sentient and sapient beings in their vicinity. PASC presence can be detected through this brief interference, as well as an increase in parietal-like tendencies in those nearby. For those unfamiliar with the term, parietal-like tendencies refer to the tendency to see patterns and meaning in random stimuli. For example, seeing a face in a piece of burnt toast, observing a surprised facial expression in the shape of a faucet, or eyes in a wallpaper pattern. SCP-7783 was first discovered by senior researchers Dr. River Corys and Caden Powell while the two were off-duty. Some of the details of this initial discovery have been redacted from the official file due to potential concerns of containment breach, but the general shape of events is easy enough to determine. The two were taking a walk in the park together when they stumbled upon the anomaly. Dr. Corys took matters into his own hands by accident, performing a semantoconceptual interaction with SCP-7783 without realizing what he was doing. 2 additional personnel were brought in, and the anomaly was successfully bound and contained. However, in the process, Dr. Corys' exposure proved to be too much, and he began the process of PASC transition. Caden Powell specifically requested that all interviews conducted between him and Dr. River Corys during the latter's transformation to be redacted from the official file on SCP-7783. Without those, we only have the general report to go on, but it does still provide an important glimpse into the transformation process. An hour after exposure to SCP-7783's effects, River displayed intact conceptual coherency and acute emotional distress. He seemed to be aware of what was happening to him, as well as his helplessness to stop it. His relationship to his physical form was still intact at this point, but he could feel just how temporary that state now was. After one day, River's conceptual coherency had gone from intact to intermittent. His physical form was still intact most of the time, but it was growing more and more difficult for him to communicate linguistically with Dr. Powell. 1 week later, Rivers' conceptual coherency was described as spurious. There was an increase in cognitive subversive influence, and his biological functions were beginning to shut down as the physical body began to become less and less tangible. After 1 month, Rivers' biological and physical form became entirely abstract. Dr. Powell observed an increase in parietalic influence, seeing the lost man's face in everything he looked at, even when it could not possibly be there. The leaves on a nearby tree, the bark on its trunk, the ripples in a puddle of water, it all looked just a bit like him. But then Powell would blink and the image would be lost. What would later be regarded as standard PASE influence began to manifest in the area, as exhibited by the parietalic effects, as well as a general psychic impression. It was most prevalent in the immediate vicinity of the disassociated fruiting body. 1 year after River first stumbled upon SCP-7783, he was entirely converted into an abstract entity. His physical form was lost, and subversive cognitive influences were observable. Even outside of PASE proximity, parietalic influence persisted for associated individuals. The most affected was Dr. Powell, who continued to see Rivers' face everywhere he looked. It became so prevalent for him that he sought a psych evaluation, but it was confirmed that he was not suffering from any mental illness or grief-induced hallucinations. This increase in pattern seeking by the brain and recognition of facial imagery and random visual stimuli was due to Rivers' lingering PASE influence. After Dr. River Corys was lost to SCP-7783, Caden Powell took on the role of Provisional Containment Director. His number one priority was to determine methods that might allow for the reversal of SCP-7783's effects. As far as I can tell, no such methods have been uncovered yet. But Powell is persistent and has dedicated every ounce of his brainpower and every resource afforded by the SCP Foundation to uncovering a way to restore those lost to SCP-7783. During my research into SCP-7783, I was able to access an interview between Research Director Caden Powell and D-Class number 78990, conducted as part of a larger study on PASE cognitive subversive impressions. The purpose of this test was to induce an impression in order to open up a line of communication with PASE-01, formerly Dr. River Corys. If PASE-01 could influence the mind of an individual, perhaps that individual could act as a conduit of sorts, through which Powell and River could speak directly. Research Director Powell began the conversation with a polite greeting and the confirmation of D-78990's date of birth and full legal name. D-78990 confirmed his identity and asked what exactly they were doing during this experiment. Powell responded, "Well, essentially, I'm here to just talk to you for a bit, take some notes on your behavior and the like an evaluation of sorts." D-78990 shifted awkwardly in his seat and asked what they should talk about. Powell shrugged. The response shocked D-78990. "Aren't you leading the way?" Powell shrugged again, idly clicking his pen. His brow furrowed, his thoughts seeming to be far away. "I guess we could start with something like, say, a favorite color." "Favorite colors?" The D-Class couldn't help but laugh at that. "Favorite colors? I thought it'd be something more, I don't know, science-y?" Powell sighed. "Well, I'm mostly just monitoring your behavior, looking for any signs indicative of..." D-78990 sat up a bit more stiffly in his chair, anxiety spiking. "Signs of what? I got cancer or something?" "No," Powell shook his head. "Just... never mind. Why bring up cancer out of all things?" Now it was D-78990's turn to shrug. "I don't know. My dad died of it, a long time ago." "What type?" "Lung cancer, stage 4. The conversation felt less like a typical Foundation research interview and more like the makings of an awkward first date. The back and forth, the get-to-know-you dance of questions and half-hearted answers. Powell offered a verbal olive branch, an attempt to sympathize. "I knew someone whose dad passed from lung cancer." "Yeah, well, we probably saw it coming. He was a pack-a-day smoker for..." Powell interrupted. 22 years. D-78990's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, nice guess. Yeah, 22. You know, I would have loved to work here," D-78990 remarked. "Really?" Powell raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" From what I've seen, you don't have a research background. I wanted to go into medicine when I was younger, you know. Powell nodded. Would have been nice to work for a place like this, one with a real purpose, you know. Powell smiled weakly. Yeah, it definitely beats working in IT for a bunch of geriatrics. D78990 laughed at the remark, and Powell furrowed his brow, confused. River would have laughed at that joke. At the unexpected mention of his lost partner, Powell flinched. Yeah? D78990 nodded. He would have, yeah. Always hated working back in Loxy. Powell's eyes lit up with nostalgic recognition. Yeah, I remember. I remember it too clearly. D78990 laughed along with him, despite never having worked with Powell and Dr. Corey's in the past. Oh, definitely. It was crazy times, crazy times. Used to get so mad at that place. Get run up for the stupidest stuff, you and... Man, me and him. We really did. Chris always had a stick up his butt, though. Made it hell. He was too old to be working, that's why. Always decomposed at the desk. What was that one joke you made about his nose to me? D78990 was now speaking about Dr. Corey's memories in the first person. Which one? Powell asked. The night after D&B? Oh, the one about him looking 8 and 80 at the same time? D78990 cackled, throwing his head back. Please. Oh, God. River was crying laughing to that. That night was the most he had laughed in a long time then. Powell cracked a smile. Yeah, I remember that night. It was amazing, just making stupid jokes to each other, enjoying the time we had. Like all the time in the world was ours, huh? Made everything better. Life was perfect. Powell sighed. The neighbors didn't hear perfect, D78990 remarked. But the neighbors always complained about how loud we were. Powell shook his head. Well, I was loud. Noisy. That was something you liked about him. D78990 switched back and forth between third and first person, sometimes speaking about River, and other times speaking as if River was talking through him. I still remember his laughing. I still remember it all. D78990 smiled wistfully. He just didn't know how to take it seriously. Powell laughed at that, a smile breaking free from his mask of composure. Ha! Well, yeah, that's how he was. Always loud and bursting with energy. Made every situation colorful. Wonder if this River guy's still like that, D78990 remarked. Oh, he's still out there somewhere. Powell wiped the tear from his eye. Still the life of someone's party. Who is? Powell's stomach dropped. That was it then. The impression was gone. He sighed, composing himself. He wouldn't show his grief to this stranger. He forced a terse, polite smile. Never mind. And that was the conclusion of the interview. D78990 and Dr. Powell had never spoken prior to the interview, nor had D78990 ever previously met Dr. River Corys. Still, with some anomalous intervention, the two had been able to share a few memories of the man, and for a moment, he was still as he was, tangible, human, alive. But the moment was fleeting, as are all impressions of those changed by SCP-7783. As for containment procedures, the specific instructions for the semantoconceptual, or related to the inherent semantic information of a concept in reality, binding of SCP-7783, may only be accessed by a select few specialists. Any personnel assigned to the area are strictly prohibited from any hypothetical, speculative, fantastical, or intimate thought related to SCP-7783. I am only able to engage with the subject matter to this degree from a safe distance, and do not suggest you approach the area after learning this much about the anomaly. Due to its particular nature, amnestics are not sufficient to treat its impact on the human mind. Complete amnesticization of personnel regarding its existence, or lack of existence, would cause semantoconceptual unbinding. This would technically result in a containment breach. Such is the trouble with semi-corporeal constructs. Essentially, as long as it is known to be contained, the containment should hold. If you have a bit of a headache trying to wrap your mind around the whole situation, you are not alone. Though amnestics are not an acceptable solution to SCP-7783 and its influence, selective thought-blocking medications derived from Class C amnestics can be used to induce a sort of deliberate brain fog, a barrier that prevents an individual from thinking about SCP-7783 in any way that extends beyond particular containment-related tasks and day-to-day Foundation operations. Once upon a time, in the earliest days of my research, I may have said that I didn't believe in ghosts. As a man of science, I balked at the concept of that which I could not prove with empirical data. But now I have seen, encountered, and learned of too many inexplicable forces in this world to hold the same view. Perhaps the victims, and I do believe them to be victims, of SCP-7783 are not ghosts in the traditional sense. They did not die, after all. Their bodies simply dissolved. Their consciousness remained in some form. But is that not what we think of when we think of a ghost? The lingering impression of someone who was once flesh and blood? Take away the body, and what remains, whether you call it a spirit or a personnel-associated sapient concept, seems to meet the criteria. Dr. River Corey's is gone. At least, the part of him that could be seen, perceived, known, and loved. What remains is that brief impression, that glimpse of a memory, ever so brief, that laugh, once shared, never to be heard again. There may not be any rattling chains or creaks on the staircase, but SCP-7783 has created its fair share of what I feel compelled to call ghosts. Agree or disagree with my verbiage, I don't mind. Those left behind are still just as haunted. Check out the DrBob Patreon and become a junior researcher today. Now go and watch another entry from the files of DrBob, like SCP-5150, Anomalous Dental Office.